Welcome back, Midnight Stories family. Get ready for another heart-touching tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's dive into today's story. The soft hum of the clock on the living room wall marked the passage of time, but tonight, its rhythm felt heavier. Robert sat alone, the glow of the table lamp casting long shadows across the room. The air carried a weight he couldn't quite name, a tension that settled into his chest and refused to let go. On the coffee table lay her phone, left behind in haste, its screen dark and still. It wasn't like Karen to forget her phone. She was meticulous almost to a fault. He had always admired that about her, but lately he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The late-night work calls, the sudden plans with friends he had never met, and the lingering scent of cologne he didn't recognize on her scarf, they were pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to assemble. As he reached for the phone, his hand hesitated. He had never invaded her privacy before. Their relationship, built over 25 years, had thrived on trust. But tonight, trust felt like a fragile illusion. His thumb hovered over the screen as he thought of their wedding day, her smile radiant and full of promises. How had they come to this moment? The screen lit up with a sudden notification. A message preview appeared. Miss you already? Can't wait for tomorrow. Love you. Robert's breath caught in his throat. The sender's name, Mark, wasn't a stranger. Mark was his best friend, a man who had shared their dinner table, their vacations, their laughter. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker, more suffocating. His heart pounded as he read the message again, hoping he had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, he knew the truth was more devastating than he was ready to admit. The life he thought he knew was unraveling before his eyes. As the screen dimmed, Robert realized that the trust he had held sacred for so long was slipping away, one text at a time. Robert and Karen's relationship had always been a story of contrasts. From the moment they first met at a university debate competition, their differences drew them together. Robert, with his methodical and thoughtful demeanor, had been captivated by Karen's vivacious energy. She was the kind of person who could light up a room with her laughter, and he often found himself wondering how someone so full of life had chosen him, a quiet and reserved man with a knack for solving problems. Their early years together were a whirlwind. They moved into a tiny apartment near campus, where they spent long nights dreaming of the life they would build. Karen worked part-time at a local cafe while Robert juggled his studies and a job at the university library. Money was tight, but those were some of their happiest days. They would sit on their second-hand couch, sharing instant noodles and laughing about the future they couldn't yet see but desperately wanted. Robert remembered how Karen used to leave little notes in his books, scribbled reminders of how proud she was of him. He would find them during his long study sessions, and they always gave him the push he needed to keep going. "You're going to change the world," one note had read, a promise she believed in more than he did at the time. As they settled into married life, their dreams began to take shape. Robert's engineering career took off, and Karen threw herself into raising their two children, Lily and Andrew. She was a natural mother, endlessly patient and deeply invested in their lives. Robert admired her for it, but as the years passed, he realized they had started to live parallel lives rather than intertwined ones. He was often consumed by work, his days stretching long into the evenings, while Karen navigated the chaos of PTA meetings, soccer games, and piano recitals. When the kids left for college, the house grew quiet. Robert hadn't anticipated how the silence would affect them. He thought it would be a time to reconnect, to rediscover the love they had built their life on. Instead, they found themselves drifting further apart. The routines they had settled into over decades seemed to suffocate any sense of spontaneity. Karen filled the void with new hobbies and social engagements. She joined a book club, volunteered for a local charity, and started attending fitness classes. Robert was glad she had found ways to occupy her time, but he hadn't realized how much those activities were pulling her away from him. At first, the changes in Karen were subtle. She started dressing differently, trading her comfortable sweaters and jeans for sleek dresses and heels. "I just want to feel good about myself," she told him one evening when he commented on her new look. Then came the late nights. She would come home from charity events long after he had gone to bed, her explanations always breezy and casual. "It ran late. You know how these things go." Robert wanted to believe her. He clung to the trust they had built over 25 years of marriage. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. It was the little things that gnawed at him, the way she would glance at her phone and smile at a message, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't his lingering on her scarf, the way she seemed distant even when they were in the same room. Mark's presence in their lives was another layer of complexity. Robert had met Mark in college and their friendship had been a constant through the years. Mark was the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of anything. He was charming, quick-witted, and had a knack for making people feel important. Karen had always gotten along well with him, but Robert had never thought twice about their camaraderie. Mark was family, a fixture at holiday dinners and summer barbecues. Looking back, Robert realized there had been moments that should have raised red flags. Like the time Karen mentioned Mark helping her plan a fundraiser. "He's just so good at these things," she had said, her tone light but filled with admiration. Or the way Mark would always find a reason to stop by when Robert was working late. At the time, Robert had chalked it up to coincidence. Now he saw it differently. For Karen, her connection with Mark had been unexpected. It started innocently enough. A shared drink after a charity event, a conversation that felt more intimate than it should have. Mark had a way of listening that made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt with Robert in years. She told herself it was just a friendship, but as the weeks turned into months, she found herself looking forward to their interactions in a way that made her stomach twist with guilt. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the emotional pull was too strong. Mark filled a void she couldn't ignore. He made her feel alive, desirable, and understood in a way that Robert hadn't in years. She loved her husband, she always had, but their marriage had become a shadow of what it once was. The laughter and intimacy they once shared had been replaced by polite conversations and long silences. For Robert, the weight of his suspicions was unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was unraveling, but he didn't know how to confront it. The man he had trusted with his life and the woman he had built a life with were at the center of his growing doubts. He found himself replaying moments in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. The way Karen and Mark had shared a laugh at the last barbecue, the time Mark had casually mentioned how much Karen worked herself too hard at the charity, these moments now felt like puzzle pieces he didn't want to put together. Karen, for her part, was living in a constant state of turmoil. She hated the lies, the deception, but she couldn't bring herself to end it. Mark was a lifeline, a way to escape the monotony of her marriage. But every time she looked at Robert, she felt a pang of guilt that threatened to consume her. She knew she was risking everything they had built, their home, their family, their history, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Audience engagement. Have you ever looked at someone you love and wondered if you truly knew them? What would you do if the foundation of your life started to crack beneath your feet? Behind their familiar smiles, there were cracks they didn't dare to acknowledge, cracks that now threatened to fracture their entire world. Karen's relationship with Mark began as nothing more than casual camaraderie. It was a series of small moments, seemingly insignificant exchanges that slowly wove a web of intimacy. Their first real conversation outside the usual social pleasantries occurred at a charity event Karen had helped organize. Mark, ever the charmer, had shown up with his usual confidence, offering to help her manage the logistics. "You're a lifesaver," Karen had said, her smile genuine as she handed him a stack of registration forms. "Anything for you," he replied with a wink, his tone playful but carrying an undertone that Karen didn't quite know how to interpret. At first she dismissed it. Mark had always been a flirt. His charm was part of what made him so likable. But as the night went on, their conversation deepened. They talked about their shared frustrations, the pressure of constantly meeting expectations, the feeling of being taken for granted. For Karen, it was refreshing to be heard, to have someone pay attention to her thoughts and feelings without the distraction of day-to-day obligations. In the weeks that followed, Mark became a regular presence in her life. He would text her about charity updates, sharing jokes or anecdotes that always seemed to brighten her day. It felt harmless, just a friendship. But Karen knew she was walking a fine line when she began looking forward to his messages more than she should. Mark, for his part, was well aware of the boundaries he was crossing. He had always admired Karen, not just for her beauty but for her warmth and intelligence. She was everything Robert didn't seem to appreciate anymore. While Mark had no intention of causing harm, he found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. Their connection deepened during a late-night charity meeting at a local cafe. Most of the volunteers had left, but Karen and Mark stayed behind, poring over the event's financials. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to more personal topics. "Do you ever feel like life didn't turn out the way you thought it would?" Karen asked, her voice tinged with melancholy. "All the time," Mark admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I think it's about finding moments that make it worth it, you know?" Karen nodded, her gaze lingering on him a moment too long. There was something disarming about his honesty, something that made her feel safe and seen. When Mark reached across the table to brush a stray strand of hair from her face, the gesture felt natural, almost inevitable. That small act was the catalyst for everything that followed. What started as innocent conversations quickly escalated. They began meeting more frequently, sometimes under the guise of charity work, other times with flimsy excuses that neither fully believed. The lines between friendship and something more blurred until they were no longer distinguishable. Karen was acutely aware of the risks. She thought about Robert and the life they had built, the decades of trust and shared history. She thought about their children, now grown but still tethered to the idea of their parents as a solid unit. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her, yet she couldn't stop. Mark represented a version of herself she thought she had lost. The vibrant, passionate woman she used to be. Mark, too, felt the gravity of their choices. He knew he was betraying his best friend, a man who had always been there for him. But his feelings for Karen had grown too strong to ignore. He justified his actions with the belief that their connection was different, that it was something real in a world full of superficial relationships. The affair took its toll on both of them. Karen found herself lying more than she ever thought she could. Late-night charity meetings became her alibi, but the guilt gnawed at her. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Robert slept beside her, wondering how long she could keep the charade going. For Mark, the stakes were just as high. He feared what would happen if Robert ever found out. Their friendship was more than a bond, it was a lifeline, a source of stability in his otherwise chaotic life. Yet, every time he saw Karen, the rational part of his mind lost its voice. The risks extended beyond their personal lives. Karen's involvement with Mark began to affect her social standing. Friends and acquaintances noticed her spending more time with him, their whispers growing louder with each passing week. She knew it wouldn't be long before someone confronted her, or worse, Robert. Financial security was another looming threat. If Robert discovered the truth, Karen would lose not just her marriage but the stability she had relied on for years. Their shared assets, the home they had built together, the life she had come to depend on, all of it was at risk. Mark, too, had much to lose. His career, built on his ability to connect with people, would crumble under the weight of a scandal. His charm and likability wouldn't save him from the fallout of betraying his best friend. As the affair continued, the fear of being caught became a constant undercurrent in their interactions. Every glance, every touch carried the weight of potential discovery. Karen found herself jumping at the sound of Robert's footsteps, her heart racing whenever he glanced at her phone. Mark, too, was on edge, carefully monitoring his behavior around Robert to avoid arousing suspicion. Their actions began to erode the foundation of their lives, creating cracks that were impossible to ignore. Karen and Mark both knew they were playing a dangerous game, one that could destroy everything they held dear. Yet, the pull of their connection was too strong to resist. What started as a harmless exchange was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. Have you ever wondered how far you would go to feel alive again? Would you risk everything for a fleeting moment of passion? With every passing day, Karen and Mark found themselves deeper in a web of deceit, their choices threatening to unravel not just their own lives but the lives of those they cared about most. The cracks in Robert and Karen's marriage, though initially subtle, were becoming impossible to ignore. Robert's suspicions, once fleeting thoughts he could push aside, began to cement into a haunting certainty. It started with little things, Karen's phone always seeming to be face down on the table, her reluctance to let it out of her sight. Then there were the odd gaps in her schedule. A 2-hour charity meeting that stretched to 4, or an unexplained delay in her return from errands. One evening, as Robert sat on the couch flipping through a magazine, Karen entered the room with a hurried step, her purse clutched tightly to her side. She had just come back from another one of her charity meetings, but something was different. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was an air of nervousness about her. She barely looked at him as she muttered something about being tired and went upstairs. Robert's eyes lingered on the purse she had set on the staircase. Something about the way she guarded it made him uneasy. After a few moments of hesitation, he approached it, his hands trembling as he opened the clasp. Inside he found a small velvet box. His heart pounded as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold bracelet with an inscription, "For the moments we steal, forever ours." The discovery hit him like a punch to the gut. Karen had never mentioned buying jewelry, let alone something so personal. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but he didn't need to. The message spoke volumes. That night, Robert lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, the words on the bracelet burning in his mind. Karen, meanwhile, lay stiff and silent, acutely aware of the distance between them. She had noticed her purse moved slightly from where she'd left it. The realization filled her with dread. Had he seen it? Did he know? The next morning, Robert tried to act normal, but his mind was a whirlwind of doubt and anger. He began to notice more inconsistencies in Karen's behavior. She laughed too loudly at her texts, hit her phone screen when he walked by, and seemed distracted during their conversations. One evening, as Karen stepped into the shower, Robert's curiosity got the better of him. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. He hesitated, his conscience warring with his need for answers. Finally he picked it up. The screen lit up with a text. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." The message was from Mark. Robert's chest tightened, his breath catching as he scrolled through their messages. Each one was like a dagger to his heart, painting a picture of a relationship far more intimate than he had feared. The texts were filled with private jokes, plans for clandestine meetings, and confessions of longing. Karen's voice from the bathroom broke his trance. "Robert, can you grab me a towel?" He quickly put the phone down, his hands trembling as he handed her the towel. The look on his face must have been telling because Karen paused, her eyes narrowing. "Is everything okay?" "Fine," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. But things were far from fine. Over the next few days, Robert's suspicions grew into a consuming obsession. He started piecing together their interactions, moments that seemed innocent at the time but now took on a sinister context. One afternoon, Robert overheard Karen talking on the phone in the kitchen. Her tone was light and teasing, her laughter unusually bright. As he entered the room, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was a charity organizer. But Robert had caught a snippet of the conversation. "I can't wait either." Same place tomorrow? Karen's behavior wasn't the only thing changing. Mark had begun to push boundaries, emboldened by the secrecy of their affair. At a dinner party hosted by Robert and Karen, Mark arrived late, his gaze lingering on Karen longer than it should have. He made jokes that felt too personal, his hand brushing hers as he passed the breadbasket. Robert watched them closely that night, his suspicions hardening into anger. He noticed the way Karen's smile faltered when their eyes met, the way she seemed to avoid his touch. The near discoveries were becoming more frequent. One evening, Robert came home earlier than expected to find Karen hurriedly closing her laptop. Her explanation was unconvincing. Something about work documents she didn't want to bore him with. But Robert had seen the reflection on her glasses, a video call with Mark. Karen's growing fear was palpable. She became jumpy, reacting to the smallest noises. Her attempts to maintain their routine felt forced, her smile strained. The pressure of keeping the affair hidden was beginning to take its toll. Mark, on the other hand, was becoming bolder. He suggested they take bigger risks, meet in more public places, test the limits of their secrecy. Karen hesitated, but his confidence was intoxicating. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, and that feeling was hard to resist. One night, as Robert sat in his study, he noticed Karen's car pulling out of the driveway. She hadn't mentioned going anywhere. His curiosity piqued, he decided to follow her. Keeping his distance, he trailed her to a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Inside, he watched from his car as Karen and Mark sat at a corner table, their heads close together. The way she laughed, the way he leaned in to touch her hand, it was more than Robert could bear. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, the reality of their betrayal sinking in. For a moment he considered confronting them right then and there. But something held him back. He wanted proof, something undeniable that would leave no room for lies or excuses. Audience engagement. With every unanswered question, Robert's doubts grew stronger, and so did the cracks in their fragile peace. What would you do if you saw the life you built slipping through your fingers? Would you fight to save it or let it fall apart? As Karen and Mark grew bolder and Robert's suspicions turned to certainty, the fragile balance they had maintained was about to shatter. Robert's discovery at the cafe became the turning point, a moment of clarity that shattered the fragile balance he had been trying to maintain. 4 days, he wrestled with the images burned into his memory: Karen's laughter, Mark's hand brushing hers, the intimacy they shared in full view of the world as if he didn't exist. The betrayal was suffocating, but Robert knew he needed more. If he confronted Karen without irrefutable proof, she would deny it, twist the truth, and he wasn't ready to give her that opportunity. The following evening, Robert stayed home from work, feigning illness. Karen had a charity event she couldn't miss, and he used her absence to search for answers. Her laptop, left on the kitchen counter, was the first place he looked. His hands trembled as he navigated through her files and emails, but it was her hidden folder labeled documents that gave him what he needed. Inside were photos, receipts for dinners he hadn't attended, and a string of emails between her and Mark. They spoke of love, of secret getaways, of a future neither dared to articulate but both seemed to crave. Each message was a dagger, cutting deeper into the fabric of their shared history. That night, when Karen returned home, Robert was waiting for her in the living room. The house was dark except for a single lamp casting a cold glow over the room. Karen paused in the doorway, her smile faltering when she saw the laptop open on the coffee table. "Robert," she began, her voice cautious, "why are you up so late?" "Sit down," he said, his tone calm but laced with an edge that made her hesitate. Karen's heart pounded as she took a seat across from him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Robert slid the laptop toward her, the emails displayed on the screen. "What is this?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the storm within. Karen stared at the screen, her face pale. For a moment, she considered denying it, spinning a lie that might buy her time. But the look in Robert's eyes told her it was futile. "You know, I can explain," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Explain?" Robert's voice cracked as he stood, pacing the room. "Explain how my best friend and my wife betrayed me? Explain how you threw away 25 years of marriage for this?" Karen's tears spilled over as she tried to reach for him. "It wasn't like that, Robert. I never meant for it to happen. It just what?" he snapped, turning to face her. "It just happened? Do you think that makes it better? That it absolves you of what you've done?" Karen broke down, her sobs filling the room. "I was lonely, Robert. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." Her words cut him deeply, but they also ignited his anger. "So your solution was to turn to Mark? The one person I trusted? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us?" Karen couldn't answer, her guilt and shame rendering her silent. The fallout was swift and brutal. Robert demanded that Karen end all contact with Mark, a condition she reluctantly agreed to. He called Mark the next morning, his voice shaking with rage as he confronted the man he had once considered a brother. "I trusted you," Robert spat. "I let you into my home, my family, and this is how you repay me?" Mark's attempts to apologize fell on deaf ears. Robert didn't want apologies, he wanted justice, though he wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. The days that followed were a blur of pain and tension. Karen tried to mend their broken marriage, but every attempt was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. Robert couldn't look at her without seeing the betrayal etched into her every gesture. For Karen, the weight of her actions was crushing. She had underestimated the depth of the damage she had caused, not just to Robert but to herself. She had lost Mark, the man who had made her feel alive, and now she was losing Robert, the man who had been her partner through life's greatest joys and challenges. The cracks in their relationship, once hidden beneath the surface, were now gaping wounds. Every conversation was a battlefield, every interaction a reminder of what they had lost. Robert's trust, the cornerstone of their marriage, was gone, and Karen wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. Audience engagement. What would you do if the trust you built over decades was shattered in one moment? Could you forgive, or is it too late for second chances? In a single moment, the life he thought he knew was turned upside down, leaving him to pick up the pieces of a shattered trust and a broken heart. The days following the confrontation were marked by an unbearable tension that hung heavy in the air. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with unspoken accusations, and the silence between Robert and Karen was louder than any words could have been. The life they had built together, the home, the memories, the shared dreams, now felt like a mockery of the betrayal that had unraveled everything. Robert found himself retreating into solitude, seeking refuge in places where Karen's presence wasn't a constant reminder of what had happened. His study became his sanctuary, the cluttered desk and worn leather chair providing a semblance of stability amidst the chaos. He would sit there for hours, staring at the emails and text messages he had discovered, trying to piece together the timeline of her affair. Karen, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt. She spent her days trying to make things right, but her efforts only seemed to push Robert further away. She would cook his favorite meals only to watch him eat in silence. She would try to engage him in conversation, but his curt replies left her feeling more alone than ever. The strain was beginning to take a toll on both of them. Robert, once a man of quiet confidence, now looked haggard and distant. His work began to suffer, his colleagues noticing his lack of focus and uncharacteristic irritability. Karen, too, was a shadow of her former self. Her once vibrant energy had been replaced by a subdued sadness, her days filled with endless apologies and futile attempts to bridge the widening chasm between them. The situation came to a head one evening when their daughter Lily called unexpectedly. Robert answered the phone, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Hi, Dad," Lily said, her tone cheerful. "How are you and Mom doing?" "We're fine," Robert replied, the lie bitter on his tongue. Lily paused, sensing something was off. "Is everything okay?" "We're just busy," he said, his words clipped. Karen, who had been listening from the kitchen, felt a pang of guilt. She wanted to grab the phone to tell Lily the truth, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. A few days later, Lily showed up at their doorstep, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "What's going on?" she demanded, looking from her father to her mother. "You're both acting weird and I want to know why." Robert hesitated, his pride and anger battling with his love for his daughter. Karen, unable to hold back any longer, burst into tears. "We're going through a rough time, Lily," she admitted, her voice shaking. "A rough time?" Lily echoed, her eyes narrowing. "What does that mean?" Karen looked at Robert, silently pleading for him to take over, but he simply shook his head. It was clear he wasn't ready to share the truth, leaving Karen to stumble through a vague explanation about stress and miscommunication. Lily wasn't convinced, but she decided to let it go, for now. "Whatever's going on," she said, her voice firm, "you two need to figure it out. You've been together too long to let things fall apart like this." Her words stayed with Robert long after she left. They reminded him of the love and respect he and Karen had once shared, a love that now felt like a distant memory. Meanwhile, Karen was grappling with the reality of her actions. She had underestimated the ripple effect her choices would have, not just on Robert but on their children and extended family. She began to isolate herself, avoiding friends and social events out of fear of judgment. The once warm and welcoming home she had built now felt like a prison. The situation was further complicated by Mark's attempts to reach out. Despite Karen's insistence that their relationship was over, he continued to send her messages, his words a mix of apologies and pleas to meet. Karen ignored him, but every notification felt like a knife to her already fragile resolve. Robert, ever the pragmatist, decided to confront Mark directly. One afternoon he drove to Mark's office, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he rehearsed what he would say. When he arrived, Mark's confident demeanor faltered as Robert stormed into his office, his eyes blazing with anger. "You have some nerve," Robert said, his voice low and dangerous. "How could you do this to me?" Mark looked away, shame coloring his features. "I'm sorry, Robert," he said quietly. "I never meant for it to happen." "Never meant for it to happen?" Robert repeated, his voice rising. "You think that excuses what you've done? You've destroyed my family." Mark tried to explain, but Robert cut him off. "Save your apologies," he said. "I don't want to hear them. You're dead to me." The confrontation left Robert feeling both vindicated and hollow. He had said what he needed to say, but it didn't erase the pain or betrayal. It was a small victory in a war that felt impossible to win. At home, Karen was trying to pick up the pieces of their broken relationship. She suggested therapy again, and to her surprise, Robert agreed. Their first session was tense, filled with accusations and defensiveness. But as the weeks went on, they began to make small strides. The therapist encouraged them to revisit the early days of their relationship, to remember what had brought them together in the first place. For Robert, it was a reminder of Karen's unwavering support during his early career struggles. For Karen, It was a chance to reflect on the love and stability Robert had always provided. Despite their progress, the road to reconciliation was far from smooth. There were moments of anger and despair, of doubt and regret. But there were also moments of hope, a shared laugh over an old memory, a quiet conversation that felt almost normal. Audience engagement. The weight of their choices was heavier than they had ever imagined. Could you find it in your heart to forgive, or would the betrayal be too much to overcome? As Robert and Karen navigated the aftermath of their choices, they began to realize that healing wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about rediscovering the love they thought they had lost. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Every glance exchanged between Robert and Karen carried the weight of unspoken accusations and lingering hurt. Karen had been avoiding public places, ashamed of what others might think if they knew the truth. Robert, though outwardly composed, was a storm inside, his anger and heartbreak threatening to consume him. The fragile truce they had managed to maintain was about to break, and they both knew it. One Friday evening, Robert received a call from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. The conversation started innocuously, but it soon took an unexpected turn. "You know, Robert," the friend began hesitantly, "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I saw Karen and Mark together a couple of weeks ago. They didn't see me, but, well, it didn't look like just a work thing." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. Even though he already knew, hearing it from someone else brought the betrayal into sharper focus. "Where?" Robert asked, his voice cold and steady. "The Vineyard Bistro. They were in the back corner talking quietly. I thought you should know." After hanging up, Robert sat in silence for a long time. His mind raced as he considered his next move. The bistro was one of Karen's favorite places, a quiet, intimate restaurant where they had celebrated anniversaries and milestones. The thought of her sharing that space with Mark was unbearable. The next day, Robert did something he never thought he would. He followed Karen. She had mentioned running errands, but Robert had learned to mistrust her words. Staying a discreet distance behind her car, he trailed her as she drove across town. When she pulled into the parking lot of a small boutique, Robert parked a few spaces away and waited. His patience was rewarded an hour later when he saw Karen leave the boutique and head straight for the Vineyard Bistro. Robert's heart pounded as he watched her enter the restaurant, her demeanor nervous but purposeful. Unable to contain himself any longer, Robert followed. As he stepped inside, the maitre d' greeted him, but Robert waved him off, his eyes scanning the room. There, in the far corner, sat Karen and Mark. They were leaning in close, their faces tense as they spoke in hushed tones. Robert approached the table with a slow, deliberate stride, his presence unnoticed until he was standing directly beside them. Karen looked up, her face paling as she registered his expression. Mark stiffened, his confidence evaporating under Robert's glare. "Well," Robert said, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the restaurant, "this is cozy." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Mark, too, seemed at a loss, his usual charm failing him in the face of Robert's fury. "What is it this time?" Robert continued, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Another work meeting? Planning a charity event? Or are we just reminiscing about all the wonderful moments you've stolen from me?" "Robert, please," Karen finally managed, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like. Isn't it?" Robert's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby diners. "Because it looks exactly like the betrayal I've been living with for months." Mark stood, attempting to defuse the situation. "Robert, let's not make a scene. We can talk about this." "Talk?" Robert cut him off, stepping closer. "You've had plenty of time to talk. Behind my back. In my home. With my wife." Karen reached for Robert's arm, but he pulled away, his gaze never leaving Mark. "You're a coward," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You wormed your way into my life, pretended to be my friend, and then destroyed everything I held dear. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mark swallowed hard, his usual bravado replaced by fear. "I never meant for this to happen, Robert. Don't you dare say that." Robert shouted, his voice shaking. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Both of you did." The restaurant was silent now, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Karen's tears spilled over as she tried once more to explain. "Robert, I know I hurt you, but this is unforgivable," Robert interrupted, his voice cracking. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family, our memories, everything we built together. How do you expect me to move past that? Karen sobbed, her hands trembling as she reached for him. I don't expect you to forgive me, Robert. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I need you to know, it's over. Whatever I had with Mark, it's over. It has been for weeks. Robert laughed bitterly. Does that make you feel better? That you ended it before I found out? Because it doesn't change the fact that you started it in the first place. The confrontation reached its peak when Robert turned to leave. Karen called after him, her voice desperate. Robert, please. Don't walk away from me. Don't walk away from us. He stopped in his tracks, his shoulders heaving with the weight of his emotions. Slowly he turned back, his eyes meeting hers. Us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There hasn't been an us since the day you decided I wasn't enough for you. With that he walked out, leaving Karen and Mark sitting in stunned silence. The moment of truth had arrived and there was no turning back. Robert had said his piece, but the echoes of that confrontation would reverberate through their lives for years to come. In the days that followed the confrontation at the Vineyard Bistro, Robert found himself standing at a crossroads, staring into the abyss of what his life had become. The anger, betrayal, and heartbreak were still raw, cutting into him like jagged shards of glass. Yet amidst the chaos of his emotions, a deeper question began to take root. What now? Karen too was grappling with the aftermath. She spent her nights in tears, her days consumed by a relentless ache of regret. She had lost Mark, but it was losing Robert that truly broke her. For years he had been her anchor, the constant in a world that often felt uncertain. To see the devastation in his eyes, to hear the finality in his voice as he walked away, was a pain she could never have prepared for. Their home, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield of silence and unspoken words. Every room seemed to carry the echoes of their shared history, memories that now felt tainted. The framed photos on the mantel, the laughter captured in time, were painful reminders of what they had lost. Karen wrote Robert a letter one night, her hands trembling as she put pen to paper. In it, she poured out her heart, admitting her faults and apologizing for the pain she had caused. She left it on his desk, unsure if he would even read it. When Robert found the letter the next morning, he stared at it for a long time before opening it. Her words were raw, filled with a vulnerability he hadn't seen in years. She spoke of her loneliness, her mistakes, and her longing to find a way back to the love they once shared. But Robert wasn't ready to forgive. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. He needed time to process everything, to decide whether their marriage was worth saving or if it was beyond repair. Reflecting on the past. As the days turned into weeks, both Robert and Karen found themselves reflecting on their journey together. For Robert, the memories of their early years were bittersweet. He remembered the nights they stayed up talking about their dreams, the way Karen's laughter could light up a room, and the comfort of knowing she was always there. But those memories were now overshadowed by the pain of her betrayal. Karen, on the other hand, was haunted by the choices she had made. She replayed the moments that led her to Mark, wondering how she had allowed herself to stray so far from the life she and Robert had built. She realized that she had been searching for something she already had, she just hadn't been willing to fight for it. The family fallout. Their children Lily and Andrew were caught in the middle of the storm. Lily, ever the peacekeeper, tried to mediate, urging her parents to seek counseling and reminding them of the love they had once shared. Andrew, however, was less forgiving. He was angry at Karen for her actions, angry at Robert for shutting down, and angry at the situation for tearing their family apart. One evening, Lily confronted her father. "Dad, I know you're hurting, but do you really want this to be the end? You and Mom have been through so much together. Doesn't that count for something?" Robert sighed, his heart heavy. "It does, Lily. But sometimes love isn't enough. Trust is what holds everything together, and once it's gone..." His voice trailed off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. A turning point. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Robert had taken to spending his evenings walking in the park, seeking solace in the quiet. One night, he found himself sitting on a bench, watching the sunset. An elderly couple strolled by, holding hands and laughing softly. Their connection was palpable, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt. As he sat there, a thought struck him. Was it possible to rebuild what had been broken? Could he and Karen find their way back to each other, or was the damage too great? He didn't have the answers, but for the first time in weeks he felt a glimmer of hope. A second chance. When Robert returned home that evening, he found Karen in the kitchen, staring out the window. She turned as he entered, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Robert broke the silence. "Do you think we can fix this?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Karen's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I don't know how, but I want to try. I want to fight for us, Robert. If you're willing to give me a chance, I'll do whatever it takes." It wasn't an easy decision, and the road ahead was far from smooth. They began attending counseling sessions together, peeling back the layers of hurt and resentment to find the love that had once been their foundation. It was a painful process, filled with difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But there were also glimpses of hope, small moments of connection that reminded them of what they were fighting for. Do you believe relationships can survive betrayal, or is some trust too fragile to rebuild? Would you have made the same choice or walked away for good? As the months went by, Robert and Karen began to heal, both individually and as a couple. They learned to communicate in ways they hadn't before, to address the underlying issues that had driven them apart. Trust, while not fully restored, was being rebuilt piece by piece. For Robert, forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about choosing to move forward despite the pain. For Karen, redemption came in the form of accountability and a commitment to be the partner Robert deserved. Their journey was far from over, but they had taken the first steps toward a new beginning. The lessons of their choices lingered longer than the pain, serving as a reminder of the fragility of trust and the resilience of love. What would you do if faced with the ultimate betrayal? Is it possible to forgive, or are some wounds too deep to heal?